I worked for the now deceased, on the defense team of the now deceased former alleged boss of New York's Gambino family, Peter Gotti.
The fascination the public has with organized crime, with the Mafia. The opioid crisis, it was a big mess for the country. People were really focused on the role that the pharma companies played, Purdue allegedly, J&J.
I got to sit down with somebody I'd been reading about for years, in prison.
Welcome to today's podcast brought to you by the ACMA. I'm really excited today to have with us Paul Haberman. Now, if you don't know Paul is actually an attorney and a partner at Mueller Haberman Law Group, and he's actually one of the most well-known attorneys in the country, and especially here in the Northeast. So really excited to have Paul. Paul actually focuses on healthcare, sports and entertainment law, and other areas as well that we're going to get into. Paul also has worked with a lot of professional athletes, including a boxing manager, a lot of other noteworthy clients that we'll get into. And today, especially, given what we do here at the ACMA, we're going to talk a lot about the intersection with what Paul does in pharma. Paul completed his undergraduate degree at American University, focused on political science, and he finished his law degree at Hofstra here in New York. Welcome to the podcast, Paul.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, pleasure to have you here. Really excited to talk to you. I think, you have a really interesting background. So
Thank you.
Maybe for the folks that, don't, know who Paul Haberman is, maybe tell us a little bit about your training, your background, and what made you decide to go into law.
Okay, I guess we'll go issue by issue there. Training, Hofstra University School of Law, class of 2005. We're actually coming up on the 20-year anniversary this year.
Goes by quick, doesn't it?
It does. Unbelievably so. And my hair is still the same color, at least for the next few months. So
Listen,
even more amazing.
You don't look a day over 30, Paul.
I'll take it. If I took off my glasses, I'd look about 80, though. So. But, from there, in law school, and we'll get into this in a moment, I think, my original focus was criminal defense. And to that extent, I worked one summer with spending a few days with a Queens criminal court judge and a few days with a boxing promoter who was also a criminal defense attorney. And then my second summer, I was working for a criminal defense attorney on a number of matters, but in particular, fairly sizable murder, conspiracy, and racketeering case. But having actually gone into that world, and I wouldn't be here if I had gone into the criminal world, I sort of made a turn from that to the health and sports worlds, given a series of circumstances. I literally had an opportunity the same day that I wound up accepting an offer from a boutique law firm out of law school to also instead work for an attorney that was very involved with organized crime and drug trafficking cases. And I made that conscious decision after having done those types of matters for a year and an irreplaceable third year of law school, but nice place to visit, but I didn't want to live there, suffice to say.
Right. Interesting. So that's definitely a switch from racketeering, the kind of criminal side, into healthcare and sports.
Sort of. Here's how it linked. This firm had a series of clients who had been sued by insurance companies on a civil racketeering theory. So they needed somebody of my level that knew something about racketeering, that would be able to help out the other one or two attorneys that were actually trying to handle these cases, work that out. So all of a sudden, I went from essentially alleged wise guys and drug traffickers to doctors that were doing goofy things, suffice to say, with their insurance billing and what have you. So,
especially with what just happened with United Healthcare CEO, just to jump to that.
Okay.
Because it's on a lot of people's mind, right? A lot of people probably didn't realize how much of a mess the U.S. healthcare system is with the prior auth denials, the billing issues. A lot of patients who want to get access to treatment oftentimes can't get it because of prior authorizations. In the case of Louis Mangione, he actually, I guess, because of his frustration, I can't remember if it was him or his mother, someone couldn't get access to care.
Right.
And that obviously set him off to do something which was crazy, obviously doesn't justify it. But,
right.
I mean, given some of the experience that you've had working in the healthcare side, I know you've represented a lot of big healthcare systems.
Right.
What's your take on that with prior authorization, billing, the whole healthcare system?
Well, I think it goes without saying nothing justifies what Luigi Mangione did on the one hand, but obviously there's a lot of people out there that sort of see where he might have been coming from. Most people wouldn't act on that. I mean, a lot of people don't like attorneys or police or or what have you either, and that's not the solution. But suffice to say, yeah, I mean, prior authorizations is a source of a lot of grief for millions of people. What's interesting about that is that statistically, they're not that much. A lot of things will be authorized on the first try, but percentage-wise, it seems to be low. But in reality, it's several 100,000 matters or whatever it is a year. And when they're challenged on appeal, which could take God knows how long, depending what you're talking about and what the time sensitivity is, that's time that a lot of people don't have.
Exactly.
Or resources a lot of people don't have to contest in the first place.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think for a lot of people listening out there, they probably don't know that the number one reason for care delay in the United States is actually prior authorizations.
Right.
So the majority of the time when patient can't get their medication, can't get the treatment, whatever they're looking for, it's usually because of a prior auth, because of a payer, right? Because of a healthcare insurance company. So It's definitely frustrating. I'm sure people are wondering, you mentioned organized crime, and I know at least, obviously I understand attorney-client privilege, but at least I know for one, a client, you're able to talk a little bit about that. I think people are interested to hear your experience in working in organized crime, and who was that person?
I'll say alleged organized crime because I was on the defense team. But,
okay.
But I worked for the now deceased, on the defense team of the now deceased former alleged boss of New York's Gambino family, Peter Gotti, my last year of law school. And, as I was alluding to before, you can't replicate that experience, being on that high level a case with so many interesting moving parts, both in and out of court. Was fascinating. Loved it. I got to sit down with somebody I'd been reading about for years, in prison and BS with him and his co-defendant in court and see all these.
So you actually sat down with Gotti?
Yeah, I mean, I would go with my boss at the time to visit him for trial prep and stuff like that. So, and attended the trial as well. So, I was there if anything was needed, sort of emergently. And I was also watching another trial the first summer that I worked. I started working because a couple of the witnesses overlapped. So that was an very interesting experience, to say the least. But as I indicated, you kind of get the flavor for it, and you're like, I liked him a lot. I'll say that. I'm not just saying that, because of who he was, but others around him, or others around the so-called life that I've met, a little more unsettling at times, suffice to say.
I think that's an understatement. Well, what's interesting? If you watch now, I don't know if you know, so Sammy the Bull Gravano, Michael Francese, they've kind of done like a 180. And I think they have podcasts now.
They do.
I don't know. Do you watch them?
Well, I actually just this past weekend I watched what was the name of it? The Sons of Ecstasy, Gravano's documentary about his ecstasy bust on HBO Max there.
And how was that?
That was very well done. I've seen his podcast snippets and his interviews before. I haven't watched all of them in their entirety, but he has a lot of sound bites he likes to put online.
Right.
That was the first time I'd seen him and his family at length, so that was kind of cool.
Yeah,
it's kind of interesting.
It's interesting to me the fascination the public has with organized crime, with the mafia, right? And you see that, the popularity with Sammy the Bull and Michael Francese and their podcast, how many subscribers they have. It's crazy. People are really fascinated to understand kind of the inner workings of that life. How did you get, first of all, that opportunity? I mean, you're in college. How did that come up? How did that happen? I think.
Well, and that's the fun thing with law school. You get access to worlds, and being an attorney also, access to worlds you otherwise would never have access to.
Right.
And one thing I'd like to read about growing up, and there's a lot of news about it that kind of helped me pique my interest, was exactly that. So organized crime. And I communicated that in a cover letter to my eventual boss. And he gives me a call, and he's sort of like, I got to ask you, how does somebody that's like this far along in law school already know that they're into racketeering specifically? I'm intrigued. And then he took off from there. I had actually accepted a job already. But then he tells me that he picked up Peter because of a conflict with his original counsel. I'm like, you got who?
Interesting.
Okay, let me change my summer plan a little bit here.
Right.
And it wound up being an excellent experience. not just, I don't mean to sound like a fanboy, but I mean the high level of work and
absolutely.
pressure was an excellent early crash course for me.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
I'd been a paralegal at a big law firm on Capitol Hill before law school, and that gave me a good sense of the hours and mental toughness you needed. But this was actually high level sort of pressure. I mean, it wasn't just like because this case got so much attention, it was also the press would be talking to you. FBI agents. I was sitting in the other case watching the witnesses. They're playing guessing games with me to try to figure out who I was there watching the case for. So, so these are like unusual things you're not going to just get from any law school job. So I just love that in retrospect. It's stuff so vivid. It was still like yesterday because
I mean, that's experience you can't get in a classroom.
Right,
Speaking of Capitol Hill, so one of the things that I did, I don't know if you know, being that I run the ACMA, is I went to Capitol Hill a few times and I met with a lot of the congressmen, women, and representatives out there talking about what the ACMA is doing in terms of standards. And actually, in 2021, we were invited, the ACMA was, by the Congress Health Subcommittee. Led by Brett Guthrie out of Kentucky at the time, to talk about the importance of standards in the industry. And one of the reasons for that was all of the attention and focus on the opioid crisis.
Right.
Now, you know, people kind of forget because it was like right before COVID, but this country in 2018, 2019 was embroiled in the opioid crisis. It was a big, big mess for the country. People were really focused on the role that the pharma companies played, Purdue allegedly, J&J and other companies. I know you just finished reading Malcolm Gladwell's book, Tipping Point, right?
The Revenge of the Tipping Point.
The Revenge of the Tipping Point, yeah.
I think it was the 20 or 25-year follow-up from the original, which was also a very influential book for me when I was applying for jobs.
So tell us about that. Well, I mean, because people, I don't think, really understand the ramifications and the effect of the opioid crisis in America. What was your take? I mean, kind of reading it as an attorney and understanding the role that pharma might have played.
Well, I think one of the things that seemed to contribute to it was the fact that different states had different sort of reporting requirements and record-keeping requirements for issuing prescriptions to begin with. So it was easier, in theory, for a doctor that might be willing to sway a little bit to to write more of these prescriptions for favored vendors or certain drugs, because whether he's getting a part of it or it's just increased volume overall to his practice, whatever. And especially in states with minimal accountability, one of the things that Gladwell gets into, I think it was California, used to require something along the lines of, maybe you've heard of this too, where they had to keep triplicates on file of all their prescriptions, and they'd be audited periodically. Yeah. So when companies like Purdue went in to target, like, how do we roll this out grandly, they completely ignored certain states that had heightened requirements, at least according to how the story is told now, and went for those states that are a little more not as high maintenance, suffice to say. I don't want to say lax. I don't know what every individual state did or didn't have, but laxer, not as much of a finger in the doctor's eyes. So that's how you have when you see 60 Minutes over the years, and like this one town in the South had 3 million, opioid prescriptions. How did this happen? That's how it happened.
Exactly, yeah. All right, so the opioid crisis, I mean, when it comes to Purdue Pharma and, again, the alleged role they played, I don't know if you had a chance to watch any of the shows on Netflix when Michael Keaton or Matthew Broderick did a show. I think it was called Painkiller. Did you get a chance to watch it?
Not those in particular, but I've seen a bunch over the years. As I was alluding to with 60 Minutes earlier, I read Malcolm Gladwell's pretty thorough analysis of it. I kept up with the headlines in real time.
I would recommend watching the one on Netflix with Matthew Broderick. Really, really good. He does a great job. He plays the role of Arthur Sackler.
Okay.
And I think it really shows how pharmaceutical companies go about strategically trying to influence physicians.
Right.
And I think one of the things that people don't realize, listening out there, is that pharmaceutical companies, look, for the most part, and as you know, I'm an ex-pharma guy. For the most part, most people working in the pharma industry, they're really trying to do the right thing, and they're really trying to be ethical in terms of what the focus is, which is patients, obviously, and the well-being of patients. Right. But you always have some bad apples. And in the case of Purdue Pharma, there was kind of this mandate where they wanted to present the data in such a way to minimize to minimize the addictive effects
Right.
of OxyContin, and that was obviously misinforming physicians. And today, I don't know if you're aware of this, but today, most of the time, education to healthcare providers happens from a department within the pharma company called medical affairs. These are medical people. They're pharmacists, they're physicians, they're PhDs. They go out and educate the doctors, and they're actually the ones that are really influencing the doctors to help them make better decisions when it comes to treatment. And the problem with the opioid crisis was what you just said, which was that they were getting misinformation, and there was really no sense of accountability. Right. And that was a big issue.
That was by design because they targeted states with less accountability on the books.
Yeah, exactly. And the reps, the reps that were after the pharmaceutical sales reps, they were given these sales pieces that, again, were showing the data in a way that was a little bit misleading for physicians. And obviously that had a lot of detrimental effects.
And I think that goes, to the purpose of the ACMA and other sort of entities. You don't want the salesmen to just be good salesmen. You want them to be learned, versed.
Right.
And honest and ethical with the topic. So,
absolutely. Yeah. Well, and that's really what the ACMA is all about. Our focus is to really raise the bar through education, through certification for the healthcare ecosystem. Speaking of the healthcare ecosystem, everybody knows, of course, just recently we had the inauguration of President Trump.
Is that right?
in case you missed it.
And the Australian Open was on at the same time, but managed to hear a little something.
Yeah. I mean, it was tough to miss some of the edicts that went out there.
Right.
So you got to make sure now you change your map. It's the Gulf of America, not the Gulf of Mexico anymore.
Right. And Mount McKinley is Mount McKinley again. I actually didn't even realize that it changed names. I've heard both over the course of time.
But one of the things that, at least from a biopharma side, that caught my attention was the appointment of RFK Jr. For the Department of Health and Human Services. And, he had been talking a lot about food quality, talking a lot about the processes by which we, develop food in our food systems and the chemicals that go in it and what that could mean, ultra-processed foods. But also...
Read that book, by the way, a very good book.
Which one?
Called Ultra-Processed Foods. Ultra-Processed People.
Oh, yes. I've heard of it. Again, I haven't read it. Yeah. But he's big on that issue, and one of the things that he talks about is pharma corruption, drug pricing. From your perspective, you work on the healthcare side.
Right.
What's your take on that with drug pricing, and who do you think really is kind of implicated in some of these issues when it comes to the control of these prices for these drugs?
Well, it's fundamentally a capitalist society on the one hand, and you can see the argument of big pharma, or really any pharma. You have smaller companies that make just one drug and things like that. They put a lot of time, effort, resources, investment, whatever it is, into rolling out these products. They want to max out on their profitability while they have the patents also.
Right.
So that's the one hand. On the other hand, the attempt to do that will, in many instances, wind up yielding individuals who are unable to consistently pay for treatments that might even be life or death, especially if they're on fixed income or low income to begin with, and what have you. And then it becomes a question of, is the best medical care or the best access to medication just for the wealthiest? And I think that's what they've been kicking around the last two administrations, two or three administrations now, trying to how to rein that in without kind of gutting the industry's profit or motivation on the one hand, but getting it out to as many people as possible on the other.
Yeah. So, it's tough, right? Because I could see the pharma industry's perspective. They've got to innovate.
Right.
And innovation costs money.
Right.
So in the end of the day, if you're capping their prices, right, which is what the Inflation Reduction Act tried to do during the Biden administration, it makes it difficult. Right, it makes it difficult because the argument from pharma is, we can't bring innovative drugs to the market if we don't have money. Right, we need that money. So putting a cap on our profit is kind of unheard of, and I could see that because again, other industries don't really have those types of constraints or limitations. On the other hand, I think, there is probably something to be said about how the healthcare system is structured, especially when it comes to the pharmacy benefit managers. I think that's a whole other topic by itself, but the PBMs and the middlemen, how they work with the pharmacies, the wholesale pharmacies and the pharma companies, definitely I think plays a big role into why a lot of these drug prices are what they are.
Right.
So tell me a little bit about your take on one of the edicts, one of the executive orders that President Trump signed, which was to withdraw the United States from the WHO, the World Health Organization. What are your thoughts on that? Because that made a lot of, news and a big splash in the biopharma community.
I think if you go searching, you could find things to pull at that might say, WHO isn't as Lord high an organization as people might think. I think, as we were alluding to, there's a good amount of contribution by the United States versus other countries. You could point to that. But, in the abstract, it's an organization that I think the world wants as many participating countries as possible, including those, especially those the size of the United States, to be involved with.
Yeah.
I think, whether it's a matter of coming back to the table and renegotiating U.S.'s position, that's something that needs to happen. We don't, God forbid, we have COVID-25 or whatever else, and all of a sudden we're not playing in the same sandbox and not sharing information. Not a good situation. But, if it's a matter of let's balance out the equities, okay. But that's we don't know what the case is just yet. But I'm hoping it's more like that than just sort of a summarily we'll do this ourselves sort of posture.
Right. Yeah.
So,
yeah, it's a complex situation because, again, the World Health Organization, they actually release guidelines. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times those guidelines are used by healthcare systems to determine how they're going to treat certain diseases, right? They're also important in trying to mine data. They have a huge database, right? Because they have data around the world. So they're trying to use that information to help maybe look for patterns or stave off certain diseases, especially when it comes to global pandemics. So obviously now the big thing is the bird flu. So, from my standpoint, I could see some of the concerns for sure in terms of pulling away or pulling out of WHO. But, again, strategically, I'm not sure the Trump administration, what the strategy is there, long term.
Right.
There's been some corruption, too, that's happened in the WHO. I think COVID was definitely an area where they could have done better. They were actually, in the beginning, WHO said not to wear a mask, and they also said that COVID wasn't an airborne disease. Later, they retracted.
There's a lot of learning on the job with that, as it turns out.
Yeah.
As there is with most illnesses. I get it kind of jumbled in my head, but I generally remember that we may have picked it up in the U.S. before they thought it was something to do one way or another. So
yeah, because it's crazy, but people forget in the beginning, they said not to wear a mask.
Right.
Which is, you would think it's kind of counterintuitive. So that was one of the recommendations. So they got slammed for that and a few other things as well. So I think, ultimately it'll be interesting to see how that'll play out. Obviously, the United States is a big contributor to the WHO, in terms of funding, like you mentioned. So I'm sure for them, that's going to impact their ability to conduct research and do studies and things like that. And as it relates to the pharma companies, that could impact, again, the ability to bring different drugs to the market and innovate because they rely on some of that data by the WHO.
Right. Again, we're hopeful, I suppose, that it's a short-term, just sort of a tweak, maybe goosing the WHO a little bit to get it more favorable, as far as U.S.'s participation.
Right, right. Tell me a little bit about your experience. I know like we mentioned before, you've defended a lot of big healthcare systems. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about, again, without getting into too much detail, but explain to me kind of what you've learned about large healthcare systems and policy and how they're structured from a legal standpoint, based on the experience that you've had in working with these big systems.
Well, a lot of that was in the context, on the one hand, of malpractice, and then for some of their doctors, regulatory issues, licensure issues, and things of that nature. You learn there's a good amount of bureaucracy, certainly. When I was working heavily in medical malpractice, a lot of it was going over towards electronic records, for example.
Right.
But not everybody had them yet. So the accountability, the record keeping, not as tidy as it is entering into a sort of a centralized system. Then when even with the centralized system, how am I as counsel supposed to know, for example, if something winds up being omitted? Certified documents tend to have every page numbered. Mm-hmm. But, still you have to wonder, is there something going on before it gets certified that we should know about perhaps? Is there something else that isn't considered as part of the certified record? So there's a lot of layers of things to deal with, and obviously a lot of layers for approval just of simple motions and everyday things that the attorneys want to do, settlements, whether it's big medical institutions or small ones, have an implication on doctors' records. So even if you're a plaintiff's attorney and it's like this one should be a layup, they're not going to necessarily settle it immediately because the doctor has to report that. So
Right.
unless the price is right and they could explain it away easier, it usually becomes a drag out just because they do have to report it at some point. So, and there's a couple of layers of approaching that in large systems. The other thing I remember is, you'll have one client that'll be like, make as many motions as you want, just fight the case. And another one will be like, well, if a precedent comes down, we don't want our name on this case. We don't want, Mount Sinai wasn't one of my clients, but we don't want Soliman versus Mount Sinai, standing for some new day in negative medical malpractice case discovery. So there's considerations like that some are more prone to than others. So
Interesting. How often do the courts look at, for example, whether or not the physicians adhere to guidelines for, let's say, a certain treatment, like when they're looking at malpractice cases? Because I'm sure you're aware of this. Mm-hmm. There's guidelines for all different diseases, right? So, for example, if you're a cardiologist and you're treating a patient for, let's say, stable ischemic heart disease, there are guidelines for that. If a physician doesn't adhere to those guidelines and then something unfortunately happens to that patient, how does that work? Because I think what a lot of people don't realize, again, that are listening out there, is that half of the time doctors write prescriptions for drugs off-label, meaning that they're not writing it for what it's indicated for.
Right. So
I'm just curious what your take is on that, and in the experiences and the cases that you've had, what you've seen as it relates to that.
Well, what's interesting is even if there's a written standard like you're getting at or guidelines, the question becomes in a medical malpractice case not just were those guidelines followed, but is not following the guideline in and of itself, according to a medical expert in a similar field to the defendants, a departure from good and accepted medical care. If you find somebody that it is, that's a problem. But to your point, for example, off-label usage. You might be hard pressed to find somebody that says, even though that's known to be safe or whatever, we wouldn't consider it that they consider it a standard until it gets really established. And you're wondering why is it still off label? But a lot of them do stay off label for a while.
Right.
So, but it's certainly the instructions and guidance that you get from outside agencies and companies is certainly a component of whether there is a departure from good and accepted medical care, long story short.
Right. So, because, the reason why I bring it up is because pharmaceutical companies actually play a really important role oftentimes in helping to shape education and guidelines for physicians once they're out of medical school. Actually, I think the statistic is that 65% of education post-medical school is actually supported and comes from pharma companies. They're supporting it, in terms of the money, right? So you kind of follow the trail. And I think in the end of the day, the question is if so many doctors are, involved in writing things that are off-label, how important then is it for pharmaceutical companies to adhere to some type of benchmark or standard? You obviously know what we do at the ACMA. I've known you for some time. Mm-hmm. This is why I'm really passionate about standardization and certification and benchmarking, especially for the people that are going out there and talking to the physicians. And what would you say to CEOs of pharma companies, leaders at these pharma companies that are listening to this podcast from an attorney's perspective in terms of risk mitigation and compliance, the value or the benefit of establishing a benchmark?
I certainly think pharma companies themselves shouldn't be the ones in charge of encouraging any off-label uses.
Absolutely, yeah. And they don't, for the record.
Right.
Yeah, they don't do that. I mean, pharma companies, they allow the medical affairs people to give that information as long as it's an unsolicited request.
Right.
But they cannot do it proactively. Absolutely.
Right. And then, you have to wonder what they know and don't know about certain off-label usages at times also. Like there was, we had a client a number of years ago, for example, that was using, I can't think of the name of the drug, but he was using it off-label to induce labor faster by inserting, which wasn't its use, but he also was getting a big reputation with his hospital because he was able to turn over more and more, people in and out of the maternity ward, so he was generating a lot of money for them. But then all of a sudden it became a problem. So that's why you'd want to stay away from it as a,
Absolutely.
But I think pharmacy companies are well advised, as you would expect, to turn square corners and only lead as far as providing advice or disclaimers or standards only with what has been the absolutely best researched and vetted, of their of the products that they engage in.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, because if you look at the data, 75% of professionals that work in compliance for pharmaceutical companies, 75% said that having some type of accreditation or certification for pharma professionals is going to absolutely mitigate risk. It's going to improve compliance. 75%. So I think, if you're a pharma exec listening out there, the key question here is, what risk are you putting your organization at by not implementing that? Right. I think from an attorney's standpoint, you would agree that this is definitely something that can, increase risk because you're not establishing uniformity and level setting your organization.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, at the very least, there'd be second guessing.
Right.
On the worst end of it, you'd have massive, colossal, and they've already happened in different contexts, product liability lawsuits and lawsuits against the pharmaceutical companies claiming, misleading, whatever, nothing good is going to come out of not having an informed or well-researched, well-thought-out, and ethical way of presenting things.
Absolutely, and I think the opioid crisis reveals that. Right, we don't want another opioid crisis. Right. All right, so Paul, as an attorney, kind of give me your perspective in terms of the legal benefits of independent accreditation and certification for pharmaceutical companies.
Well, I think there's a few things. It standardizes what people either do or can learn about. It which for legal purposes later, as we were talking about with off-label usages in different contexts, it can almost hold people accountable better. Right. You have that. I think to some extent it creates more of an ethics, more of a universal ethic. I think at the very least it would create a more informed, pharmaceutical rep or medical liaison.
Yep.
And it's more than being a good salesman. You know this a lot better than me. You should really know the topic, almost like the doctor you're sending it to knows the topic, or pitching it to knows the topic. I think the more universally learned any of these people could be, there's absolutely no downside to that.
Absolutely. I mean, here's the thing. You were just talking about malpractice. Physicians have to be board certified, right, in their profession. Right. An attorney has to do continuing education, right? You have to pass the bar.
Right.
You have to meet a certain standard. Accountants have to be certified to be able to file taxes, right? So pharmacists cannot practice until they've actually passed a licensing exam and a legal exam. So every profession that's out there is involved in somehow, some way, shape, or form needing to pass a minimum criteria of knowledge or demonstrate that knowledge through some type of certification exam. And this is why I think for people that are working in the pharmaceutical industry, pharmaceutical sales reps, medical liaisons, people that work in reimbursement, people that are working on the specialty side, all of these folks, they play such an important role in educating the healthcare system. So it's really key and it's really important to make sure that they're all meeting a minimum standard of competency. So that's why,
totally
from my perspective,
agree with that. Yeah.
I mean, to me, it's a no-brainer, right?
Right.
And go ahead.
Especially with the stakes being that high as they are with a lot of these medications.
Absolutely.
Potential side effects and how common those were in trials and contraindications to using, all this stuff matters, and they should really be encyclopedic if they're selling that to doctors. Doctors will do their own research, and they have to. But, I think when it's introduced, you should be ready to answer almost anything, and not just as a salesperson, but as somebody that's a learned, peddler of these, medications or devices or whatever else. So.
Well, and you said something really interesting. So you said you should be ready to answer any question, right, that comes up. And that's obviously difficult sometimes for anyone, right, even with a certification or board certification. One of the things that we've done at the ACMA, we've actually developed these AI companion tools.
Okay.
So it's an AI tool. It's secure. It's doesn't really hallucinate, very minimal hallucination. It's a tool that actually helps to support those people that are out in the field trying to answer questions that doctors have, because not everyone has the answer to everything, right? So
Right,
now
right.
with AI, why not leverage AI? That's a whole other topic, but I think AI is going to help to really revolutionize many industries, including obviously the biopharma industry.
agree with that. Yep.
Actually, this morning I saw Trump has put together something called Stargate. Did you see this?
I did not see that yet this morning.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So he's gotten a few of the big leaders in the AI space, it's going to be interesting to see what they try to accomplish. But it's a whole AI initiative.
Okay,
I think they're putting like $500 billion into it, so it's pretty interesting. All right, so look, I really enjoyed this conversation.
I can go on for days with you here.
Yeah, no, this has been great. I want to close out. Final question: tell me your most interesting case.
Well, there's one or two, and I'll stay on the medical topic. Obviously I alluded to one earlier, and I have been involved again with 8 current or former world champions and countless other people around sport. But let me give you 2 medical ones that I found that stood out, and I did hundreds of them, before I went into my own practice 9 years ago, then joined the partnership back in July. I had one where somebody goes into a hospital and is supposed to receive, I believe it was methotrexate, something like once a week for a number of weeks. They wound up receiving it once a day for about 10 days. And that was, what's interesting about that is obviously it's horrendous. I mean, the decedent wound up basically internally combusting from, just too much methotrexate and passing away in the hospital.
Oh, jeez.
But the interesting thing to me was that was the first medical malpractice case I ever looked at, or medical negligence case that I looked at, and I'm like, this is not one that could go in front of a jury. I mean, there's a lot of them where bad outcomes don't equal, bad treatment. This was clearly just a multi-level awful occurrence that had to be addressed. So that always stood out as an interesting one in my memory. Perhaps the most interesting one for historical purposes, I had another case involving the oral polio vaccine. Case was filed in 1981 or 1982 when I was 3 or 4 years old, depending which year that was. It went to trial around 2010. So everybody at my law firm had handled this case, and fundamentally what it was an individual was changing his child's diaper who just got the autoimmune polio vaccine, gets some of the poo, since we're on televised here and have to speak appropriately, on his hands.
You could say poo.
Yes, on his hands, and wound up getting polio from the weakened virus that was in the autoimmune. And so he wound up suing the company that came up with the virus and the doctor, who was my old law firm's client. And it's just a fascinating case. You don't hear much about stuff like that these days, but that was the state of medicine, or vaccinations, and some of the risks that might still attend their certain vaccinations today, right, playing out over a almost 30-plus year litigation. So
interesting.
With fingerprints from every attorney that had been at that firm until that time all over it. It was intriguing to be just my small part of it, helping with motions for the trial attorneys.
That is fascinating. That's really fascinating. And obviously, since COVID, vaccines have gotten a lot of attention in terms of development. Right. And just for the audience, we're not promoting vaccines, or we're also not, saying that you shouldn't take vaccines. You obviously should consult with your healthcare provider and do what's best for you in your particular case. But this has been great, Paul. I really enjoyed this. I've really enjoyed learning more about, kind of from your perspective as an attorney, some of these legal considerations that relates to biopharma, and just interesting stories, especially the Peter Gotti stories. So that always gets my attention. So been great having you.
Yes, and let me apologize again one more time for thinking your name was actually Soliman for the first year after I first met you.
Oh, is that?
It's your last name.
Yeah, that's funny. Although, my father, it's funny you said that, because growing up, my father, that's what he would go by. People would call him Solomon.
Okay.
Anyway, great to have you. Thanks, Paul.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.